What I would like to do is really just to ask you, I don't know who would like to start first. Tony, you tend to be the quieter one.
That's right.
Oh, you've noticed.
Tell me a little bit about your, well, start with at the beginning for you, 1938, your parents, what your parents did, where you were, that type of thing.
Well, I was born in a very rural district of Norfolk, in a very small village. I'm number 7 of 8 children. My father was a land worker, and we lived in a small council house. And my mother was a homekeeper in a big way, really. And I really, in a sense, the war kind of passed me by, because nothing very much happened in our village. And we knew nothing, or I knew nothing, no experiences, at any rate, of any horrors or bombings or anything of that nature. So in a sense, I had a very quiet and relatively peaceful, if that's the right word, period during the war. And as far as I can know, of course, it was a very happy childhood. Living in the country, we had absolute freedom and no worries.
Did you, your father, get involved in the war in any sort of way?
Yes, he was actually in the First World War. He was a prisoner and, in fact, wounded. So in the Second World War, he was a special constable. What those duties entailed, I'm not quite sure. I think he went round making sure that blackouts were adhered to and things like that, but that's about all there was to worry about in our village.
Yes. So, war broke out in 1939. You won't have any memories. What were your first memories of wartime, would you think?
Possibly the arrival of the American Air Force, which was there was quite a large base about 3 miles away. And I can remember the Americans being about, but quite honestly, nothing much more.
What about you, Carole? You were born in 1941. So you don't remember much of the very beginning. Well, you won't remember the beginning of the war at all, but what were your first memories?
I can remember the Anderson shelter in the garden, which both my mother and I absolutely hated. I remember being in there once and she'd got plum jam on the stove. Sugar was a luxury, and she'd managed to get some sugar. I was making plum jam when the air raid siren went. So she took me into the air raid shelter, and she stayed behind to make sure the plum jam didn't burn. And I can remember being horrified in that shelter by myself. I also remember she, eventually, we hated it so much, she made a sort of cave under the stairs. It was a tiny space, but she managed to get 2 chairs, and my father had sent from Egypt a leather poofy. We called it a poofy. I think it should be pronounced poof, but it was made of pieces of leather. And that was for me. And we sat under there when the air raid sirens went. And I firmly believe that if I hammered on this poofy loudly enough, the all clear would sound. And I vividly remember nearly on the floor hammering on the poofy to make the planes go away. I'm not sure, of course, I can only have been 2 or 3 at the time, so very small. I remember a bomb dropping nearby and demolished some shops. This was, you may know it actually, in Sharston, on the main Sharston Road there. And the following day we went along to have a look at what had happened. That was a bit horrific. The clothes rack. We had a rack for clothes that you let down and put clothes on and pulled it up again. And that was in the kitchen. And that set fire one night. I think it was over the cooker. And my bedroom was up above it. And so I remember the panic stations when my mother came to get me out of bed because the kitchen was on fire. I mean, it was all put out and it wasn't very serious, but her panic, I remember. And I have to say, we went quite recently, we took the grandchildren to Stockport to the, what are they called? Not the war cellars.
No,
where people
the air raid shelters.
The air raid shelters in Stockport. And they set a siren off. And I was absolutely petrified. This is 5 years ago. I couldn't go in. I was so upset by that sound. It was so realistic. It brought back the horror that I remember as a very, very small child. Yeah.
I don't know whether that might have triggered something for Tony, because, I mean, what was your average day as a child during the war, would you think, Tony? What were you up to?
Well, I think I went to school quite early because the school was actually about 50 yards from my house. I can remember actually using a slate when we first went in, and I also remember that the windows were all taped, and at the time I probably didn't realise why. Apart from that, I think most of my childhood was spent outdoors. Well, it had to be. We had no space indoors. Yes.
So what sort of house did you live in?
It was a council house, 2 rooms downstairs, 3 small bedrooms, excuse me, upstairs. There were, at that time, 6 children and the 2 adults. My 2 elder sisters had left home, gone into service. We had no running water, no electricity. We had the traditional village pump to fetch water from. I can remember that quite vividly. But we only lived in one room. We had the front room, which was kept for Christmas and special occasions. So we did spend 95% of our time outdoors.
And where would you have gone outdoors?
There was a field nearby. The farmers were all very good because obviously my parents knew them, and we could never get into trouble because no matter what, there was an underground. The farmer people would tell my parents where we were or what we'd been up to, and vice versa. We couldn't escape that. And I think my mother especially knew everything we did. We just wandered the fields. We played on the fields. Probably played war games, from a fairly early age. I can remember possibly post-war though, going to the local cinema. A lady took half a dozen of us by train to the local cinema. We called it the Threepenny Rush. But really, as I said earlier, the actual war didn't really touch me as a child. I didn't know that any hardships we did were being incurred. Didn't mean anything to me because I'd known nothing different.
So, I mean, your father was where at that time?
He was working on the farm.
So it was they have a special term, don't they? A reserved occupation.
No, he was too old. He would have been too old for call-up anyway,
right.
I'm sure. He was born in 1898, so he was quite elderly mature anyway when the war came along. But he did work. He went out at 7 o'clock every morning and returned at dusk, really.
So but nevertheless, doing a very important thing.
Oh, yes. I mean, my mother ruled the roost with 5 boys. She had to be fairly strong.
That was bad planning on her part.
Yes, it
wasn't
was, wasn't it?
I mean, did you see any aircraft go over or anything like that?
Oh yes, towards the end of the war, there was an American air station, as I said, nearby. Possibly it must have been late in the war. We used to walk up to the airfield and we used to watch the planes coming back. They were don't know what the term was, but they were liberators as we knew them. And the American airmen were quite good to us. We had our sweeties and gum and things like that.
So how did you meet them?
I've got a vague memory of my mother walking with a pram full of washing. I think she did laundry for the Air Force, but I can't imagine how she did it because we had no running water. She had a copper in the kitchen and that was it. But I've got a vague memory of us walking with a pram load of washing to the guard room on this airfield.
Yes. So, what about you then, Carole? How were your days spent? You were presumed you probably were too young for school almost.
I went to school when I was 3, so like Tony, I was quite young. But at the school, like Tony, again, the school was opposite, and I seem to remember my mother helping in the kitchens there, and that's possibly why I went early. And we had cowrie shells to count. You know how children nowadays have little blocks and counters and things. It was cowrie shells we learnt to count with. I've loved them ever since. It's just come back to me when Tony was talking about aeroplanes. We went to, it's now Manchester Airport, but then it was Ringway, and I think they trained men to parachute jump in the area, and there was a display of parachute jumping. And I was sitting in a pushchair, and my mother and I were watching, and this parachute was coming down over us. And she panicked. This is the second time I've said she panicked. She did panic quite a lot. She panicked. She thought the silk was going to suffocate us. And so she was desperately trying to get herself and me in the pushchair out from under this parachute. When you look at Manchester Airport now, it's hard to think we were just standing on the airfield. And another memory, which came back to me very recently, we went to visit Bramhall Hall, and in one of the rooms, the walls are covered in lincruster. Do you remember lincruster?
No.
Now, most people say, what's that? I remember it vividly. My mother really desperately wanted lincruster on the toilet wall. And she managed to save up somehow or other and get this lincruster. And it was sort of halfway up the toilet wall, and it was green with tiles on it. Linen-backed material, this is why it was expensive. And I sat on the toilet one day, and there was a little loose piece which I pulled. Oh, it made a gorgeous noise. The linen on the back ripped all the way down like that. It was gorgeous. So I pulled a bit more and a bit more and a bit more until there was a lovely fringe.
I can remember my younger sister getting married and having her wedding dress was parachute silk.
Yeah.
Probably, again, we thank the Americans for that. But it was very important then.
Yes, material was very short.
Yes.
And
I think most women of that age and that period probably got married in parachute silk.
yes, and they also made undergarments from it too,
Yes.
as well. So I believe. And,
Yeah.
I've heard this from other people who we've interviewed. So yeah. Your father was overseas in the 8th Army, wasn't he? Is that
Yes,
right?
he was. Yes. He went, I think he was posted abroad when I was a few weeks old. Yeah. So I didn't see him. I didn't know him at all. He came home when I was 5.5. But there was a photograph of him, and every night I went to bed I had to say goodnight to Daddy. And he was due home. We waited and waited on the day. He didn't appear. In the end I had to go to bed. I didn't know what to expect at all. I didn't know many men. I had some lovely uncles. My mother was one of a large family. I had lots of aunts and uncles, fortunately, who looked after us during the war. But I didn't know any men, and so I had no idea what to expect. He did arrive during the night, apparently, and came in. I vaguely remember opening my eyes and saying, "Hello, Daddy," but that's it. The next thing I remember was my sister being born after he'd been home for about 10 months. And I hated it because there was this other person here, and he was my daddy by then, and I didn't want anyone else.
So, some people resented their fathers coming home because they interfered with the family life in a way.
Yeah. No, I didn't resent him coming home at all. No. However, his nerves must have been... He wasn't a nervous person at all. He was a very cheerful, bright person, but he couldn't stand the sound of the vacuum cleaner or my mother's knitting needles. She couldn't knit because the clicking irritated him so much. I remember that vividly. And the vacuum cleaner upset him too.
Yes.
So something had caused that irritation.
Yes.
But we'll never know what.
And we have part of your father's history on WarGen already, because I think he wrote a certain amount, and I think you tried to sort of clean it up or tidy it up a bit.
Put it together,
yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry he didn't write more about his time in Egypt. He talked about it a lot.
Yes.
And he travelled a lot, and I've never quite fathomed out how he managed to do that. He seems to have gone out reconnoitring with somebody, but as his title was cook, I don't know how he managed to get away from his
he wasn't
duties.
with the long-range desert people, was he? He might have been, because they would go off and they would need someone to cook for them whilst they were travelling.
Oh, well, perhaps that was it.
I don't know.
He was very attached to
Major Carter. He went everywhere with Major Carter.
It was as if they worked together, and it sounds to be something like that.
Yeah.
Reconnaissance.
And he visited so many places. He saw all the sights, and told us all about them. I'm so sorry he wasn't able to go back later. Tony and I did a Nile cruise, and I knew all the places I was looking at from what he told me, but I'm so sorry he didn't go back.
Yes.
He'd have loved it. I know he would, yeah. I always think it was a very hard time for him, and obviously being away from his wife and I, my mother and I, must have been dreadful. But I think it was an adventure.
Yes.
As well.
And a very different life.
Very different life.
It sounds as though he may have spent quite a period in the desert itself.
Oh yes, he was in the desert.
Yes.
He learnt quite a bit of Arabic because he had Arabs working for him. He visited Bedouin tribes.
Yes.
You know, some of the stories, I don't know whether we took them with a pinch of salt, about being offered a wife, and
Quite possible.
they were quite possible. Oh, and eating what is it, camel's eye? He said he had to eat because it would have offended the people if he hadn't eaten it, and things like that. But I'm not sure how true they are.
There'll be a certain element of truth about them, I'm sure. Yeah. So, war comes to an end. Do you remember, Tony? Do you remember anything about war coming to an end at all, or
I can remember parties.
Yes.
But again, going back to the Americans, every Christmas they came around in a great big wagon, lorry, and hoisted us up, and we went off to one of their bases for Christmas parties. I can't remember any great celebration. There must have been at the end of the war, but I can't actually put my finger on it, no.
No, I don't remember anything.
I seem to have drifted through the war and just carried on afterwards. And life didn't change that much for us.
No. It would have changed for you, Carole, I think, presumably.
Yes. I can't remember anything of the war coming to an end. I don't remember any celebrations. As I said earlier, I had an uncle, two uncles who came quite regularly. One was in the RAF. The other one, I think, he was a solicitor at the town hall in Manchester. Now, why he didn't go? Because that's not that wasn't an occupation to keep him at home, I wouldn't have thought. But I was quite poorly several times, and the doctor at one time, now I don't remember this, my mother told me this, I was about 3 with pneumonia, and the doctor said there is a brand new drug that would help her, but the only place you can get it is Northenden, a chemist in Northenden, and one of these uncles cycled to Northenden and got it for me, and it was it's the antibiotic, penicillin. So it was very, very new, obviously. So who this chemist in Northenden was who had it,
some, who knows?
Yes, and how much it cost.
Yes, because this is before the days of the National Health
National
Service.
Health, no.
Yes.
So that was penicillin in about 44, I think, 45.
Do you remember rationing?
Oh,
Gosh,
yes.
yes.
I mean, for a country boy, that probably didn't affect you a lot.
Well,
did it?
things like sweets and things, yes. Yes, we lived off the land to a certain extent, my father being a farm worker.
And
Weekends
his garden, your dad's garden.
he had
Yes.
every inch was growing vegetables, which he was very skilled at.
Yes, he was.
And weekends it was often going out for rabbits, pigeons.
So you literally did live off the land.
We did to a certain extent,
Yes.
and things like potatoes and things came along from the farm. Yes, as I said, I knew nothing of the hardships. I know we never had butter, except if we made it ourselves.
Yes.
Meat, I remember a butcher coming down once a week, but we didn't seem...
That
as
would have
I
been
said,
rationed, I would imagine.
I'm sure, yes.
Yes.
So much. I can remember also that occasionally some pies arrived into the village and people went and got meat pies and they were pretty foul. But, no, as I said, we drifted through. We always had food on the table and
Yes.
and enough of it, I think, yes.
It's totally different for me. We've discussed this, haven't we? Yeah, we often were short of food. A neighbour had some hens and my mother and I used to sing the song, chick, 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 chicken lay a little egg for me, frequently. And this neighbour brought one egg and we shared a boiled egg, my mother and I, because eggs were a real treat.
Yes.
But not a problem for us. We
Not
had
a
our
problem.
own hens.
Yeah.
You had your own hens, yes. I mean, quite a lot of people did have their own hens.
I can also remember post-war, my uncle who returned from Burma, he had a pig in the backyard. They were allowed to keep a pig in those days and use the waste food for feeding, and we all had a little bit of it, I think.
So, I mean, that was a very different life in Burma. When did he return from there?
From Burma,
Yes.
I can't remember the date, but I know my aunt, we lived as a very close unit, our families.
Yes.
And my mother and my aunt lived next door to each other, joined on in a semi-detached. And I can remember my uncle coming home. Of course, there were banners out and balloons and so on from Burma. He fought actually at Kohima, which
Yes.
was a pretty bloody battle, I think. I can remember him coming home. Yeah.
Hmm.
Before the end of the war.
No, it was that was VJ Day, wasn't it? VE.
VJ Day was
later than
later in
VE.
1945,
So
yes.
he would have been, I don't know, quite a lot
Later.
later.
And he wasn't captured by the Japanese or anything like
No,
that?
but I think he went through a lot of stress. And I can remember going with him, I mean, to visit the Italian prisoner of war camp. That was his job, to supervise, Italian prisoners. There are a lot of prisoners of war around us, working on the farms, and I mean, it's all very
So he was
open.
still in uniform at that time?
I don't think he was in uniform.
Hmm.
No, I don't think he was in uniform.
No.
But that was, I don't know if he's still part of the army, in fact.
But taking on some sort of administrative job anyway, doing that presumably.
Yeah.
So war comes to an end. Is it a different life for you?
Mine was completely different because there was now a father and a baby sister.
Yes.
And Grandma came to live with us. So yes, it was very different, having been just my mother and I. And lots of men around as well. You know, there were, and at some point, and I don't know the details of this. At some point, a Canadian stayed with my mother. Now I presume he was serviceman of some
Billeted to there, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the details, but he stayed with my mother, and he used to send clothes when he went home. Clothes from his daughter used to come for me, and they were just beautiful. Nothing like them. Well, nothing we could afford here. Yeah. Oh, and something else I've just remembered was going into Manchester on the bus. There were barrage balloons down Princess Road. I'm not sure what the fields are called. The fields are still there. They've not been built on.
Half End, probably.
Yeah, is it Hough End? Coming from Altrincham into Manchester, they're on the left.
Yes, that's probably Half End, yes.
Yeah, and
yes.
there are a lot of
Not
barrage
that far
balloons.
from Didsbury
No, that's
and Withington.
Right, and Withington.
Yes.
Yes, I think it is Withington there. Yeah, there were barrage balloons there, which I thought were gorgeous. Great big balloons. I mean, actually, they were horrendous things, weren't they, with chains hanging down to stop the aeroplanes. I suppose it was the aeroplanes. Would they be heading for Old Trafford, perhaps, or the docks? I don't
Almost
know.
certainly. I mean, the Salford Docks, Old Trafford, they were
Yeah.
key target areas, weren't they? As I've heard
They
from
were.
other people we've interviewed.
Yeah.
Carol, speaking about the Canadians, I can again, this is a photograph I tried to
We
remind
tried,
you of.
yeah.
There were two Canadian soldiers billeted with my grandmother, who again lived 2 or 3 houses away. I can remember them, but not much about them. I can remember them being there.
Yes.
And of course, we had evacuees.
So where did they come from?
The evacuees
Yes.
from London.
Right, so they were children who were moved out of London to,
Yeah.
to make them safe and
Yes,
so
yeah.
on.
And I
Yes.
can remember the knit comb
Oh, yeah.
vividly. In fact, there was we called it the old school. What a building which had previously been a school, was the village hall, was set
Yes.
up for the evacuees. I can remember that quite
What, for a
clearly.
school?
As a school, yes. Yeah. They didn't mix with us in our, well, they mixed. And my aunt, who, as I said, lived next door, she had an evacuee boy.
Yes.
And in actual fact, this is going off the track. You remember Mrs. Garwood?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
When I went to London for working, my first digs was with the parents of one of the evacuee girls.
Oh, I
who
didn't
we got to know,
that.
yes, from the village. So, yeah,
Small world.
it is, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, my aunt in Timperley had a evacuee child. I would have thought Timperley was a bit close to Manchester, but She did have a child.
Well, I know that places like Cheadle were also used for evacuation.
It's a bit close, really.
Well, you'd think so.
I think the people who came from the east end of London to Hulme Hale, where I lived, must have had quite a culture shock.
Yes.
Because I can remember this lady saying, horrified that there were no street lights, you know, and things like that.
Well, I was horrified when I first went to this village, so I'm sure they were.
Well, how did you meet?
How did we meet? Oh dear.
I mean, you're living
Yes.
far apart.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was at college and my friend knocked on my door and said, "Oh, I've got a date with this chap tonight and he frightens me to death, but he's bringing his friend, so will you come with me?" And I said, "Oh, no, I'm going to wash my hair tonight." "Oh, come," she said, "come, it'll be free beer and cigarettes." So I said, "Oh, go on then." So we actually met on Putney Bridge. Tony was the friend, and the other chap who frightened poor Pam was your friend from the village, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So yeah, we met on Putney Bridge and went to the Star and Garter. I don't know whether you know Putney Bridge, but
I do.
Star and Garter's still there.
Yes. So why were you in London?
I was at college training to be a teacher, and
I had trained to be a teacher and I was working in London.
he was teaching.
Right.
I was,
When did you meet? What?
When? Well, that must have been 61, because I was in my last year at college, wasn't I?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the rest is history. Isn't
The rest
it?
is history, yes, yes. So
again, quite a cultural mix.
yes, yes. I really was very taken aback when I first went to Norfolk, to this village. I mean, very rural. Yeah.
Especially after, I mean, you said were you brought up in Sharston, I think you said.
Yes, my mother is of a long line of Mancunians, and she was very, very proud of Lady Simon of Manchester, who gave the land for the Wythenshawe estate.
Yes.
And the whole family, my mother, her mother, 2 or 3 sisters, all were the first people in the first houses. I suspect the uncle who was a solicitor at the town hall had something to do with that. But nevertheless, they were the first residents. And it was a wonderful childhood. I mean, the reputation of Wythenshawe now, I'm so sad, because I had a fantastic childhood. We had a lovely house. All my family, all my aunts and grandma all had a lovely house. Fields all around. I played round where the airport now is.
Yes.
So yes, I grew up there, and then I went to school in Manchester, grammar school at Whalley Range, which was then a girls' grammar school. Got to know Manchester well as a teenager, and yeah, very happy growing up altogether, but totally different from Tony's.
Yes. I mean, when you first married, where were you living then? In London, or?
We started in London.
We had 1 year in London, didn't we? Then
We couldn't afford
to buy a house there.
No. No.
I did, my first 2 years were in Moss Side, teaching in Moss Side, and I loved it there. Very, very happy school. So when we got married, I went to Brixton expecting to find a similar situation, and it wasn't. I hated it. Didn't like it at all.
In a city.
It wasn't the community that I'd been used to in Moss Side. Moss Side was a real community. People helped each other.
Yes.
Brixton wasn't like that.
Were there problems in Moss Side at that time, or?
No, not really. We were just beginning to get some West Indian children coming in. Then that was 61. So, but I don't remember any problems at all.
No.
I mean, you might hear about the odd fight round a back street, but then, or drunks. And I do remember drunken people on the bus. You could smell.
And that presumably was as a result of people who'd been through the war, do you think? I mean, people who'd been affected by...
What, the people drinking? You know?
Yes. Or am I wrong with that?
I
They're a very poor area, wasn't it?
Oh yes, it was very
The
poor.
poverty, I think, was the
Yeah.
problem more than race or
Yes.
anything else,
Yes,
as far as I can
probably.
remember.
I mean, I remember as a child, and I know I shouldn't be saying this really, but as a child, we came across people who were living on the land, if you like, tramps, wandering
Yes.
around. And that was directly, I think, as a result of the war
Yes.
and what they had gone through. But I
Yes,
don't know
I'm
whether you
sure.
experienced anything like that, but particularly in the country.
Yeah, there were tramps, but we just accepted it. And there's no animosity or anything, we just accepted them for what they were.
But they
Yes.
lived.
They wandered
rough.
around it.
They weren't.
Yeah.
And I think they wanted to live that way, didn't
Yes, I
they?
think so.
Yes. Yeah. I usually ask a killer question, but before we do that, you were married in the 60s. Did you stay in London at that time, or did you come back to Manchester?
We had 1 year there, didn't
Yeah,
we?
and then you came back?
Then we came back. We both were lucky enough to get jobs in Macclesfield.
Oh, right.
So we moved to Macclesfield.
Right, so that's a little way out. I mean, it's about 20 minutes on the train these days, but yes.
It was very nice to live there.
Mm.
We could afford a house there and
Yes.
had our children there.
And then retired to Timperley.
Well, we came to Timperley because my parents were there, which meant that I could go back to work because they were there to help with childcare. So we came to
right.
Timperley. For
And for
that
my job
and
as
for
well.
your job. Yes, you changed jobs then, didn't you?
So what were you doing by that time, Tony?
Well, I was still teaching when we moved to Timperley. But I didn't like teaching. And when I worked in Macclesfield as a teacher, I used to do bar work, as most teachers did, I think, in those days, and got to know the people who used the bar and became friendly with them.
Yes.
And we've been in Timperley 2 years. When I
Right.
just got a letter from one of the men I'd met in the bar, said, "Look, we're looking to open a shop in Altrincham. How do you feel?" So I just wrote back and said, "Great." I didn't think about it, but you were worried about it.
I was
weren't you?
very worried
Yeah.
about him giving up a secure job like teaching to go and run this hire shop, which we'd no idea whether it would work or... Fortunately, it did.
So you found something you enjoyed?
Oh, yes. I stayed with it.
Yes. I think we're probably coming towards the end of the interview, unless there are other things that are pressing. I mean, but I have a killer question that I often ask people, and I spring it on you, and that is, if you were advising a youngster today about how they should go ahead with their lives, what advice would you give them?
Oh, goodness me.
I thought that'd be dead easy for teachers.
Oh, gosh. No. We are in a kind of position where we've got grandchildren
Yes.
who are late teens, and we have spoken about it, haven't we?
We have.
Certainly as far as the financial situation is concerned, I wouldn't have a clue
No.
what to advise. I think the only advice is to find an occupation that you're happy with, and if you're happy in it, then I think you'll progress.
Yeah.
But
We've got half our family are in New Zealand. So our son married a girl from New Zealand.
Right.
And their life there is so totally, totally different. I think travel around and have a look experience as much as you possibly can. And I'm very sad that children don't seem to, well, I know they don't read like we did. And I think we gained a lot of, can't call it experience. Second-hand experience
through books.
from what we read. I didn't read anything serious. It was all novels, stories, fiction.
Yes.
But nevertheless, vicariously, I picked up lots of information about things, and I think children are missing on that now. It saddens me very much that they don't read for pleasure, as we
Yes.
used to do.
Yes.
But that's not really giving advice, is it?
I always feel that youngsters these days are perhaps not living in a real world.
That's true.
Yes. I think from my own point of view, I have very rarely said no. I know that can be taken in lots of ways, but if anything comes along like this, that I'm in the slightest bit interested in, I say, oh yes, let's have a go, have a look at it, have a try. And I think that would be my advice. Don't turn your back on anything till you've had a good look at it.
Good advice.
I've had lots of strange experiences because of that. Tony quails sometimes.
Well, that's leaving us with a cliffhanger, but Carole, Tony, thank you very much for participating in the WarGen adventure. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
It's very interesting.